The ballroom glittered under the glow of chandeliers, a golden sea of gowns and tuxedos filling one of Los Angeles's most prestigious hotels. It was an evening meant to celebrate cinema, the kind of night when Hollywood polished itself until it gleamed, every smile rehearsed, every handshake calculated. Red carpets were still being rolled up outside as stars mingled within, sipping champagne and posing for photographers who never seemed to lower their cameras. At the center of this universe of glamour was Sandra Bullock, radiant in her understated elegance, seated near the front where the cameras lingered longest. To the world, she was America's sweetheart, talented, witty, and timeless. Yet beneath the shimmer of the night, not every gaze cast upon her was kind. As the ceremony unfolded, whispers began to circulate. A few critics, seated strategically near the press tables, leaned into one another with smirks curling at their lips. They had come armed not with applause but with barbed remarks disguised as commentary. Some mocked her recent film choices, others dredged up tabloid headlines that had nothing to do with her artistry. It was as though the night's splendor gave them license to sharpen their words, testing just how far they could push while the cameras rolled. One critic, emboldened by laughter from his peers, raised his glass in mock salute toward Sandra and muttered something cruel enough that the surrounding tables went uncomfortably silent. Sandra, ever the professional, responded the way she always had, with grace. She forced a laugh, the kind that carried no real amusement, and kept her eyes forward as though their remarks slid off her like rain against glass. Yet the strain was visible. Her smile faltered in the corners, her hands fidgeted with the fabric of her gown, and her usually bright eyes seemed dimmer under the harsh lights. She had built a career on strength and resilience, on roles that demanded both humor and grit. But in that moment she was simply a woman being publicly diminished, with few willing to intervene. The cameras, however, noticed everything. They caught her glances down at the table, her long pauses between smiles, the way she held her breath before daring another laugh. In living rooms across America, audiences would later wonder why she seemed subdued, why the sparkle that defined Sandra Bullock was struggling to break through. For those in the ballroom, the tension became undeniable. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to challenge the critics yet unable to stomach the cruelty being dressed as cleverness. And then, as if on cue, as though fate itself had been waiting for the moment, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. A hush fell as heads turned, the energy in the room tilting on its axis. Keanu Reeves had arrived, clad in a simple black suit that seemed deliberately modest against the extravagance around him. He moved with quiet assurance, a presence that demanded attention without ever asking for it. Conversations softened, whispers paused, and eyes that moments ago were focused on Sandra's discomfort now tracked the man whose very name carried weight in Hollywood. For those who knew the depth of his friendship with Sandra, a silent question lingered in the air. What would Keanu do when he realized what was happening? The spotlight shifted toward the stage as the next award was announced, but for Sandra Bullock, the brilliance of the lights only made the shadows around her feel heavier. She sat upright, shoulders squared as though rehearsing composure, yet inside, the sting of those whispered jabs lingered like cuts that would not close. The critics' voices seemed to echo louder in her head than the applause that filled the room. Each snide remark replayed itself, washed up, past her prime, only good in rom-coms, words that were never meant for microphones but delivered just loudly enough to humiliate. Sandra's instinct was to do what she had done so many times in her career, smile through it. Hollywood had always demanded resilience from its women, a performance that extended far beyond the screen. If she laughed along, if she appeared unbothered, perhaps the cruelty would lose its edge. And so she tried. Her lips curved upward into a practiced grin, her laugh floated across the table like a thin veil, and when the cameras panned across her, she tilted her head just so, the picture of grace under pressure. But for those seated nearby, the truth was harder to ignore. Her fingers drummed against the stem of her glass, restless and uneven. Her eyes avoided the critics' table, darting instead to the stage or to the chandeliers above, anywhere but the smirking faces only a few feet away. Every so often, her smile collapsed before she quickly forced it back, as though afraid that one slip would betray her vulnerability to an audience eager to feast on it. She was Sandra Bullock, strong, beloved, resilient. Yet tonight, even she felt the weight of being alone under 1,000 unkind eyes. The room itself seemed to reflect her silence. Guests exchanged sidelong glances, whispering just out of earshot, their discomfort palpable but their actions non-existent. Some shook their heads subtly at the critics' behavior, but no one confronted them. Hollywood was, after all, a place where silence often protected reputations better than truth. And so Sandra bore the cruelty alone, her silence becoming both shield and prison. She sat there, smiling through the ache, silently wishing the night would end, silently hoping that no one beyond those tables had noticed. But someone had noticed. At the back of the room, Keanu Reeves had taken his seat just moments earlier, his eyes quietly scanning the ballroom with the perceptiveness that so often set him apart. He had seen her laugh, but more importantly, he had seen the effort it took. He had noticed the way her hand trembled slightly as she set down her glass, the way her smile broke in tiny fractures before she stitched it back together. And as Sandra Bullock sat in silence, trying to bear the weight of cruelty with dignity, Keanu Reeves leaned forward, his gaze fixed not on the stage, but on her. Sandra's silence had been her answer to the critics, an act of dignity, of restraint, of choosing not to descend to their level. But in the quiet corners of her heart, she wondered how much longer she could keep pretending it didn't hurt. And in the quiet corners of the room, fate was preparing to answer her question, for her silence had been noticed by the one man in Hollywood whose voice, when raised, carried not only authority but undeniable sincerity. The night was far from over, and Sandra Bullock was about to discover she was not as alone as she felt. The ballroom doors had opened quietly, almost humbly, but the shift in the atmosphere was unmistakable. Conversations faltered, champagne glasses paused mid-air, and the room's restless energy seemed to collect itself into focus. Keanu Reeves had entered, not with the flamboyance of a Hollywood star accustomed to the spotlight, but with the quiet gravity of a man who never needed to demand attention to command it. His presence was magnetic, steady, and oddly disarming. Clad in a tailored black suit that bore none of the extravagance around him, he moved with the ease of someone who had long since rejected Hollywood's vanity yet was still respected within its core. Guests offered polite nods, some clapped softly, and a few simply stared as he passed, their admiration unspoken but evident. Keanu responded with the same humility he always carried, a small smile here, a gentle nod there, before taking his seat just a few tables away from Sandra. But it wasn't the cameras or the applause that drew his focus. His eyes immediately found her. Sandra Bullock, poised as always, sat with her head tilted, her laughter airy but forced, her fingers whirring the edge of her napkin in a rhythm only she knew. To anyone else, she looked composed. To Keanu, who had known her for decades, who had watched her navigate the labyrinth of fame with courage and humor, the facade was transparent. He saw the cracks. He saw the effort. And he saw the pain she refused to let others glimpse. The critics, emboldened by the fact that Sandra hadn't fought back, pressed their advantage. Another remark floated across the table, a veiled insult wrapped in a laugh. A ripple of awkward chuckles followed from those who didn't dare challenge the tide. Sandra lowered her gaze, her lips tightening in the kind of smile people wear when they are trying not to break. And in that moment, Keanu's expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, his hands folding neatly in front of him, his gaze unwavering as it settled on the critic's table. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't a confrontation. It was the calm, unshakable stillness of someone who had endured enough of life's cruelties to know when silence was no longer acceptable. The air around him seemed to shift, as though the room itself recognized that something was about to change. Sandra glanced up then, her eyes briefly meeting his. For the first time that evening, her guarded expression softened, a flicker of relief passing through her as if the mere sight of him had lightened the burden she carried. She didn't need to say a word. The years of friendship between them had always thrived on unspoken understanding. Keanu nodded once, a subtle but unmistakable gesture, a silent promise that she would not have to stand alone. The critics, oblivious to the storm that was quietly gathering, continued their chatter, smirking over their glasses, unaware that their words had finally reached the wrong set of ears. Keanu Reeves had arrived, and the night that was meant to humiliate Sandra Bullock was about to be rewritten. The critic leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass as though the night existed for his amusement. With a smirk curling his lips, he tossed another jab across the table, louder this time, bolder, aimed to pierce. Well, at least Sandra's good for a laugh. Hollywood's queen of safe roles, right? Maybe next time she can star in her own retirement commercial. A few at his table chuckled, others shifted uncomfortably. The cruelty, once whispered, had now grown brazen. The sound carried farther than he expected. Heads turned. Conversations stilled. Sandra's forced smile collapsed in that instant, her eyes falling to the tablecloth. She lifted her glass to hide her face, but her hand trembled just enough for those closest to notice. For a fleeting moment, the ballroom held its breath. And then, before the critic could smirk again, another voice cut through the silence. "Funny," Keanu Reeves said evenly, his tone calm but sharp enough to slice the tension. "I always thought talent was measured by the impact you leave, not the bitterness of those who couldn't achieve it." The room froze. Keanu hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gestured theatrically, yet every word carried weight. The critic blinked, caught off guard, his glass lowering slightly. Keanu didn't look away. His gaze was steady, his posture unshaken, as though he'd been waiting for this very moment. "You want to talk about careers?" Keanu continued, his voice firm but never cruel. "Sandra Bullock has carried films that defined a generation. She's made audiences laugh, cry, and believe. She's lifted stories that would have sunk without her, and she's done it with more grace and humility than most of us could ever hope to show in this industry." His words rolled through the ballroom, not fiery but resolute, each one striking with precision. The critic shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering as murmurs spread across nearby tables. Guests who had once looked away now nodded subtly, their unease transforming into quiet agreement. Keanu's calmness only amplified the power of his words. No theatrics, no spectacle, just truth spoken with conviction. "And let's not forget," Keanu added, his eyes never leaving the critics, "this industry doesn't need more people tearing others down. It needs people who can build something worth remembering. Sandra has done that, over and over." "What exactly have you done?" Besides sneer from the corner of a ballroom. A hush fell so deep that even the chandeliers seemed to listen. The critic, once smug and untouchable, now sat small in his chair, unable to muster a response. His companions glanced away, distancing themselves from his arrogance. And in that silence, the balance of the night shifted. Sandra looked up then, her eyes meeting Keanu's. Gratitude shimmered there, unspoken but undeniable. He hadn't just defended her, he had restored her dignity in front of those who tried to strip it away. For the first time that evening, her smile was real, fragile but luminous, a spark of relief and strength returning. The applause began quietly, from one table near the front. Then another. And then the entire ballroom erupted, a wave of clapping that swept through the room like thunder. Keanu hadn't just silenced the critics, he had reminded everyone why Sandra Bullock was not just a star, but a force. And why he, Keanu Reeves, remained one of the most respected men in Hollywood. The applause swelled like a wave, rolling across the ballroom until it became impossible to ignore. Hands clapped, voices cheered, and the sound echoed against the gilded walls with a force that seemed to wash away the venom of the critics. The spotlight that had felt so harsh and exposing only minutes before now seemed warmer, softer, as though the entire room had shifted its allegiance in an instant. And at the center of it all sat Sandra Bullock, her expression trembling between composure and release. For a moment, she simply sat still, her eyes shimmering under the light. It was as if her body didn't quite know how to respond after holding so much inside. She pressed her fingertips lightly to her lips, almost as if to keep the emotion from spilling out too quickly. But when she finally looked up at Keanu, the dam broke. Gratitude, relief, and unspoken affection surged through her gaze, a silent confession of just how much his words had meant. Sandra was no stranger to public praise. She had won awards, heard critics laud her performances, and felt the embrace of millions of fans. But this was different. This wasn't scripted or rehearsed. It wasn't about accolades or career milestones. It was about dignity, about being seen when she felt invisible, about being defended when she had chosen silence. Keanu's words had not only quieted her detractors, they had reminded her that she was not alone in the fight against them. The tears came then, not in a flood, but in a glimmering line that traced down her cheek. She brushed them away quickly, laughing softly at herself, a laugh that was finally genuine. The audience responded with even louder applause, as though cheering her strength as much as Keanu's defense. People rose to their feet, the ballroom erupting into a standing ovation that felt less like a formality and more like an act of solidarity. The critics, so loud only minutes before, now sat in stiff silence, their smirks erased and their glasses untouched. Keanu didn't bask in the applause. He didn't stand, didn't gesture, didn't smile triumphantly. He simply leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, his gaze steady on Sandra as though making sure she knew that the moment wasn't about him. When their eyes met again, she mouthed a simple, "Thank you." He gave the slightest nod, a gesture that spoke louder than any words. Always. For the first time that evening, Sandra Bullock felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She had arrived at the ballroom braced to endure yet another round of whispered cruelty, but now, she sat in the glow of something far more powerful than the flash of cameras: respect. Respect not just for her career, but for her resilience, her humanity, and the bond she shared with a man who had just reminded the world who she truly was. By the following morning, the moment had already spread far beyond the golden walls of the ballroom. Headlines blazed across news outlets and entertainment sites. Keanu Reeves defends Sandra Bullock in Fiery Award night moment, critics silenced by Reeves' powerful words, and Keanu stands up for Sandra, a friendship for the ages. Clips of the exchange ricocheted through social media, amassing millions of views in hours. Fans reposted his words with captions like, "This is why we love Keanu," and "Protecting Sandra like the true gentleman he is." For once, the critics were silent. Those who had mocked her the night before offered no follow-up commentary, their smug remarks drowned beneath the tidal wave of public admiration for Sandra and Keanu alike. What was intended as a cruel spectacle had transformed into a story of loyalty, courage, and friendship. Even Hollywood insiders who had been in the room spoke openly in interviews about the electric shift, how the atmosphere turned from uncomfortable silence to unified applause, all because of one man's refusal to let cruelty pass unchecked. Sandra herself broke her silence days later in an interview. When asked about the moment, she paused, visibly moved before speaking. "You know," she said softly, "there are times in this industry when you feel like you're standing on a stage alone, and it can be terrifying. That night, I realized I wasn't alone. Keanu reminded me, and maybe reminded everyone, that kindness still matters, that defending someone's dignity is never out of style." Her words resonated deeply, not only with fans but with anyone who had ever endured cruelty in silence. As for Keanu, he brushed the event aside with characteristic humility. When asked about his defense of Sandra, he simply smiled faintly and said, "Sandra's one of the best people I've ever known. She didn't need me to say anything. Her work and who she is speak louder than I ever could. But sometimes, it's good to remind people of that." It was classic Keanu, deflecting the spotlight, refusing to take credit, and yet leaving an indelible mark by doing so. In the weeks that followed, the story became more than just a Hollywood headline. It became a parable of friendship, respect, and the power of using one's voice when it truly matters. Sandra Bullock's career continued to thrive, buoyed not only by her talent but by the renewed admiration of fans who saw her in a new light, not just as a star, but as a human being worth protecting. And Keanu Reeves, once again, cemented his legacy not just as a movie icon, but as a man whose quiet strength could silence a room more effectively than any performance on screen. That night in Hollywood would never be forgotten. It was the night Sandra Bullock's silence was broken, the night cruelty was defeated by compassion, and the night Keanu Reeves reminded the world that true power isn't found in tearing others down, it's in lifting them up.